each other for so long. Your heart's been aching, but you're too shy to say it. Inside we both know what's been going on. We know the game and we're gonna play it. And if you ask me how I'm feeling, don't tell me you're too hard to see. Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna run around and desert you, never gonna make you cry, never gonna say goodbye, never gonna tell a lie and hurt you.
Alrighty, Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. We're going to finish up Chapter 20, the last section before the Civil War, 1854 to 1861. A lot of key events here listed, and we're going to go over all of them today. We also want to give a shout out to Rick Astley. March 1988 with the song Never Gonna Give You Up, and hopefully you understand how that relates to this section. This was the #1 song in the 1988. If you get a chance, watch the video. Rick Astley's video, A-S-T-L-E-Y. I'm telling you, it's like a wow moment. We have quite a few slides, so I'm going to go to them relatively quickly. First section, the financial crash of 1857. Hey, we got another panic. Every 20 years in the 1800s, 1819, 1837, 1857 is a new one, and there's a common cause of all of them over there. Okay, it is overproduction of grains and over-speculation in land and railroads. And to me, over-speculation is probably #1 cause of panics. Overproduction is #2. Overproduction caused prices to drop, which hurt farmers. Over-speculation in land and railroads made people lose their homes and their farms to the bank. All right, I think the key thing to highlight with the Panic of 1857 is that the North is hit very hard with this panic. A lot of hardships in the North, especially in the factories. And I would highlight this even more. The Panic of 1857 does not hurt the South much at all. Okay, and this is huge because now the South thinks, hey, the United States had an economic panic in 1857, and it didn't affect us. And so the South felt that they could secede maybe sometime down the road because their economy is strong and they don't need the North. All right, quickly, the Homestead Act. We're going to get to more of this when we get to the westward expansion in the 1860s, 1870s. But this was passed by Congress in 1860, the Homestead Act, but it was vetoed by Buchanan. And I would just highlight the Homestead Act. Even though it was vetoed in 1860, it does come back again in 1862. But this law basically made it easier for people to move out west and get land very cheap. We'll talk about this later. Like I said, it was passed in 1862, so this allowed for more people to move out west. They get a bunch of land very cheaply, and it encouraged people to move out west. All right, in Illinois, rail splitter emerges. Why is Lincoln called the rail splitter? Okay, Lincoln is called this because he spent his youth out on the frontier, eventually Kentucky, Indiana, and then eventually Illinois, and he helped his dad cutting down trees, clearing land, building fences, so he's given this nickname, and this is a positive nickname for him, showing that he is a tough guy from the West. He's a hard worker. All right, a must know is that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and the Republican Party is becoming very popular by the late 1850s into 1860. And his rise into political prominence was slow. He was not a very well-known politician. In fact, he did lose some early political races that he ran for, but he had a gift, and his gift was he was a decent debater, which leads to a huge event in history that changes America forever, and it was the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, a must-know. This is one of the most important, most famous debates in American history, and a push, Abraham Lincoln versus the little giant Stephen Douglas in 1858. All right, so what was this about? This debate was not about the presidency yet. This is in 1858. The presidential election is not until 1860. So this is a series of 7 debates between Lincoln and Douglas, and it was over the Senate seat of Illinois. And the most famous debate between the two happened at a place called Freeport, Illinois. It was a town in Illinois between Lincoln and Douglas. And Lincoln, so clever that he is, he asked Stephen Douglas a question. He's like, if the people of a territory, especially we're talking about westward territories, if they vote against slavery, would they still be free territories despite the Supreme Court ruling? Ooh, what ruling was that? What ruling said that slavery does exist and that slaves are property? Was the Dred Scott ruling. So this is a tough question for Douglas to answer. And so Douglas basically says this. He defends popular sovereignty. He says the people will decide with his Freeport Doctrine. I'd highlight this. So Stephen Douglas basically says the people are going to decide, even though the Supreme Court said that they can't vote it free. Stephen Douglas said if the people vote against slavery, then it cannot exist. Well, the Southerners hear this and like, what? Stephen Douglas, what are you talking about? This goes against the Dred Scott decision. And so there's a lot of Southerners who are unhappy with Douglas. That's going to cost him later in history. All right, so Douglas does win the Senate election. I would highlight this over Lincoln. So Stephen Douglas does defeat Lincoln in the election. However, Lincoln gains more popularity with his great ability to debate. So he basically wins a moral victory over Stephen Douglas. So even though he doesn't become senator, this popularity will help him become president in the 1860 election. He's back, John Brown. I love it. He doesn't go away. Is he a murderer or martyr? Alliteration. Strong words. All right, John Brown, another John Brown event. We know about Bleeding Kansas. Highlight this one. 1859, he creates the raid at Harper's Ferry. This is a pretty big event in APUSH. So John Brown, after Kansas, moves back east. He moves to Virginia, and he leads a raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859. Basically, John Brown wanted to start a slave insurrection. He hoped to seize arms or to seize weapons from an American federal armory at a place called Harper's Ferry. And then he would call upon the slaves to rise up and would arm them and lead a major slave rebellion in the South. Well, the slaves never quite followed John Brown, surprisingly enough, so the slaves never revolted. Brown is captured, and during the raid, Brown's group does kill 7 innocent people. We know John Brown killed 5 people in Kansas, killed 7 more innocent people outside Harper's Ferry. And so he is going to get in trouble for this. So he is convicted of treason, he is sentenced to death, and he is hanged. So after his death, John Brown instantly becomes a martyr for the abolitionist cause. So, I mean, John Brown was so different. I mean, you don't know for sure, but he probably was okay with dying for his cause, okay, because a lot of people supported him in abolition after he was killed. So the South is happy that John Brown, the big instigator, was dead, but the North was infuriated that he was executed by the South. So the North is still supportive of John Brown after his death and his idea of abolition, but the North forgets sometimes that how violent he was, how he killed people in Kansas, and how out of control he really was. So that in the end, was John Brown happy? I mean, he was dead, but again, he becomes a martyr for the abolitionist cause, and people talk about him in history, good or bad. It's up to historiography. Okay, another famous document, famous painting in American history. There he is, John Brown. This is called The Last Moments of John Brown, and here he is. He is walking out of the steps, and he is going to be executed. He is going to be hanged. And there he is kissing a little slave baby or African-American baby. And this image is very heroic of John Brown. It makes him out to be the martyr that he wanted to be. All right, now we're talking about the disruption of the Democrats. So we're getting into some politics here. And into the election of 1860, the Democrats are very split. They could not nominate one candidate. So actually they nominate 2 candidates, and chances are neither of them are going to win, and that's the case. So it splits into 2 factions. Surprisingly, this is sarcasm, they're divided by region. The Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge as their presidential candidate, and the North nominated the little giant Stephen Douglas as their candidate. Also, the Know Nothing Party chose John Bell of Tennessee, and a lot of these Know Nothing people called their party the Constitutional Union Party, and these people were located in the West, especially in the areas of Kentucky and Tennessee. All right, and the Republican candidate is Abraham Lincoln. So basically we have 4 people running for the 1860 election. I wonder who wins. All right, there he is, the rail splitter. We're talking about Lincoln. He splits the Union, and he does win the election of 1860. So the Republicans, going into this election, sensing victory against the split opponent Democrats, they nominated Lincoln, and the Republican platform did appeal to many non-Southern groups. So they were for Northern manufacturers by putting a protective tariff. So Republicans, I would know this, want higher tariffs. Some of the Republicans were pro-immigrant, which is odd because there was some elements of the Know Nothing Party in there. But I would also highlight that, especially during this time period, they're for the West and expansion. So the Republicans are going to favor the Homestead Act. They are for internal improvements for roads and canals and railroads, especially in this time period around Lincoln. They're for farmers and for more land out west. So they tried to appeal to many groups during this election. The Southerners threatened that if Lincoln wins, okay, they would secede. And they do, led by, oh my goodness, South Carolina leaves us again. And so Lincoln, just a little background, he was not an outright abolitionist. Yes, he was against slavery, but I would highlight this. Lincoln, when he took over, said he would still allowed to give Southerners cash compensation for their freed slaves. So if you're a Southerner and you lose your slaves, the government would actually pay you for your property. So again, just to quickly highlight it. So Lincoln was against slavery, but he was not out there like John Brown or William Lloyd Garrison, and he was willing to compromise with the South. Okay, here's the electoral map of the election of 1816. The biggest thing, of course, is the red, and that is the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln won throughout the North. He won absolutely 0 states in the South. In fact, Lincoln was not on any ballots in the South. Okay, next, let's look at the blue. A lot of deep southern states voted for not Stephen Douglas, they voted for John Breckinridge. So he got a lot of Democratic support down here. The yellow was the other party candidate, the Constitutional Union. John Bell was here in Kentucky and Tennessee. And Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, got no votes in the North. The only state he got was Missouri. And Stephen Douglas could not even get his home state of Illinois, partially because they were for Lincoln. So this map clearly shows one-word sectionalism, and these people in the South, especially the Deep South, they are going to secede after the election of Abraham Lincoln, led by, what a surprise, South Carolina. All right, more details of the election of 1860. So we looked at the map just a second ago. So Lincoln wins only 40% of the popular vote, so he's a minority president, but he does win the Electoral College 180 to 123. And like we mentioned, I would highlight this, he was not on any ballots in the South. And some say, potentially, again, this is historiography, the Democrats, the party would have won if they united behind Stephen Douglas. Some say they would have won, but if you look at the details, that's probably not true. The Democrats, if they only had Stephen Douglas, not John Breckinridge, they still would have lost. The election would have been 169 to 134 in favor of Lincoln. So the split Democratic Party definitely helps Lincoln, but he still probably would have won. So in December of 1860, 1 month after the election, did the South have reason to complain? Yes, the president was now from the North, which is bad. But politically, the Republicans did not control the House or the Senate. Okay, so it was not in Republican hands. The South still had a 5-4 majority in the Supreme Court. So again, did the South need to secede? Were they justified? South Carolina said, yes, we do. All right, so secession begins with 7 southern states, and these are in the Deep South. South Carolina does threaten to secede if Lincoln was elected, and they do. So they're the first state to leave in December of 1860. I would highlight this. And they're followed by 6 others. You don't need to memorize them, but please know that they were in the Deep South, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and so on. The 7 seceding states want to form their new government, and they meet in Montgomery, Alabama, and they create the Confederate States of America. So we'll call this group the Confederacy. We'll also call them the South. They kind of go hand in hand. And their first president and only president of the Confederacy was a man named Jefferson Davis. All right, so now let's look at Old Buck. What are you going to do about it, Buck? Well, Old Public Functionary does not do anything to stop the secession. He does not force the Confederacy back into the Union. He decides to leave it up to Lincoln, mostly because a lot of the army was out in the West fighting Native Americans, and so he did not think he could get the army back really in time to stop the Confederacy from forming. This is probably why Buchanan is considered one of the worst presidents, because he allows the South to secede, and the Civil War is going to happen a few months later. All right, I love maps, and so this is the secession of the southern states, and we said we had 7 go right after the election of Lincoln, and here they are. So the Deep South, these 7 secede. Their capital is going to be Montgomery, Alabama. Now, here's the key thing. What about these other 4 states, and what about, and also these 5 states? Okay, these are all slave-holding states. Are these states going to join the Confederacy, or are they going to stay in the Union? And we'll get to this in Chapter 21. Does anybody know which states actually joined the Confederacy? We'll see. All right, so some people in the North wanted to try to prevent the secession of the South, so they are going to try to force a compromise to keep them back in the Union. that President Buchanan doesn't do much. And the compromise is called the Crittenden Compromise. I would highlight this. And basically, here's the compromise. They were going to bring back the Missouri Compromise line of 3630 and extend it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And the Crittenden Compromise basically said, we will ban slavery north of the line, which is what most of it was, but we will allow slavery, we will protect slavery south of the 3630 line as a way to keep the southern states back in the Union. So the western territories would prohibit slavery, like I said, north of this line, and the federal government will protect slavery in the south during the territorial status and allow the people to still use popular sovereignty to decide their final status. Again, so the Crittenden Compromise was designed to keep the seceding states back in the Union and try to give them a little compromise to stay with the United States. So here's a map of the proposed Crittenden Compromise. I'll give you a little foreshadowing. It never happens. But this 3630 line was going to prohibit all slavery north of the line, but south of the line they can vote for popular sovereignty. Ooh, and what if we go even further south? What if the United States starts to conquer new territories? The federal government would protect slavery until the people would vote through popular sovereignty, whether it be slave or free. And in the end, it never happens. The Crittenden Compromise is not passed, mostly because Lincoln is opposed to it. Okay, he was a part of the Republican Party, and they were against the extension of slavery, and so he wanted to stick with his party. And again, he was against slavery anyway, so he's like, nope, we're not going to do it because my party is against the extension of slavery. So the Crittenden Compromise never happens, and so the 7 southern states are definitely leaving the Union. Also, Buchanan, who was so weak, he was considered a lame duck president. So after Lincoln was elected, Buchanan was still president for 4 months, but he had no power during this time period. So he couldn't really do anything about it. And again, another reason why the Crittenden Compromise fails is because potentially, this is again was supposed to keep the South happy, but this would maybe make the South want to keep acquiring more and more territories. So that means the United States is going to be imperialist, could invade Cuba, Central America to gain more slave territories, which would cause problems with the North. All right, finally, why did the South secede? And there's so many reasons behind it, but basically, the South felt their rights were being taken away and threatened as the slaveholding minority. Again, they were alarmed at the growing power of the North, especially in terms of wealth, power, population-wise, industry-wise, so they're worried about that. Many Southerners supported secession because they didn't think the North would do anything about it. So a lot of Southerners said, they're going to let us go. They're not going to fight us to keep us in the Union. So they didn't really plan on a civil war. And the South truly believed this. This might be the biggest thing I'd highlight. They believed that Great Britain and France would support them if needed in a war with the Union. So if the South went to war with the North, these two places would support the South, number one, because they probably don't like the United States very much. And number two, the South supplies with the cotton that they want. More foreshadowing, they don't get the support from Great Britain and France, and that ultimately dooms them in the war. Okay, the last slide, the Southerners, why they seceded. They also thought, their leaders, thought an independent South would have a great opportunity for the South to develop its own banking and its own shipping system, its own industry. So they felt they now can be free of the bond of the North, especially with northern banks, and they can be on their own and to start maybe their own industrialized society. And the final cause, it kind of relates to the Declaration of Independence, the idea of nationalism and self-determination. Okay, these are themes that go back to the Revolution, okay, that we should be able to determine if we want to be our own country. So we thought we should be able to break away from Great Britain, and also pride in your country or region. The South was a very prideful region. And so they said the 13 counties broke away from Britain in 1776. They broke away against the tyranny of King George III, and the South was doing the same thing against the tyranny of the North. And the South really thought they're going to win this war, they're going to get support from Great Britain and France and become the Confederacy of America forever. Thankfully, that never happened. Thank you, Abraham Lincoln.